Hey guys, welcome back into the channel. We're starting a new series today on History Mondays. We're starting a series on China. Alright guys, China is by far one of the most interesting, one of the most controversial, one of the most impactful and consequential countries on the international sphere today. In fact, I would say that the US-Chinese relationship is probably by far the most important bilateral relationship between any two countries in the world because of the power of the militaries and the economies that these two countries have. And so it's really important that on this channel we give a grasp, a historical understanding, a context for understanding China, its motivations, its political systems, its people, its history, so that we can understand the type of stances that the Chinese government takes and about the sort of policy positions we think they're going to inch towards going forward. So let's get started. So in starting our historical overview of China, what you need to know is we're going to start from the mid-1800s. We're not going to do a huge backstory of ancient China because it's not as relevant as the history from let's say 1840 all the way up until today. What you do need to know about ancient China and China leading up to the mid-1800s is that for the vast majority of world history, China was the hegemonic power in Asia. And not only was it the power, much of the culture, much of the language, much of the societal impact of China actually infiltrated many of the different countries surrounding China. So you can see a lot of Chinese influence in Korea, Japan, Vietnam. A lot of these different countries share some cultural ties, historic ties to China, and there was a sort of a tribute system where these countries would pay tribute to or be underneath the leadership of China throughout history. And so the Chinese government and the Chinese people, perhaps rightfully so from a historical point of view, viewed China as sort of the main Asian power. Now, crucially, what we're going to talk about today is this 100-year period, more or less, called the Century of Humiliation, where China takes a back seat to other powers in the region and, importantly, to Western imperial powers in the region. Now, the Century of Humiliation discourse, as scholars call it, is extremely important for understanding China's people, China's political system, and Chinese policy, because it's the fear of going through another period of humiliation because of foreign influences that the Chinese government does some of the things it does, that it takes the kind of stances it takes in certain areas because they're trying to fight against being humiliated like they were during this century. So let's take you through a quick tour of the Century of Humiliation. And again, it's so important that we understand this if we want to understand contemporary China. So, like I said, the Century of Humiliation refers to a period of time where international powers, both regionally in Asia and more specifically Western imperial powers, had a lot of control, a lot of influence over China. Now, there were a number of different events, a number of different wars that the Western powers and specifically Japan used to kind of keep China down and to exploit it of its human and natural resources. The first of these wars was the First Opium War between China and the British. Long story short, the British won the Opium War and they got access to a lot of different ports of China. They opened up China to international port access, and crucially, they got control over Hong Kong. The second of these events was an internal event, a civil war called the Taiping Rebellion. Now, this was mostly a poor peasant civil war against the dominant Manchu-led status quo power, and it was very bloody, very deadly, and created a lot of rifts, even more rifts within Chinese society, particularly between the poor peasants in the south and the established powers in the north. The next of the events is the aptly called Second Opium War, this time between Britain and France and China. The British and French won. They got more access into inland routes into China. Crucially, they got navigational abilities on the Yellow River into China, which is one of the main hubs of transportation in China, one of the main resources that the British and the French can use to get some of the resources out of China and transport it into regional and European markets. Very discouraging, very humiliating for the Chinese because it had to open up Chinese borders. Also during this period, you've got the French taking control of Indochina, long under the direct or indirect control of China. You've also got the Boxer Rebellion, another internal kind of civil war event. These Boxers were domestic sort of cult-like figures who rose up and tried to rebel against the foreign influence in Chinese land, and it took an alliance, a foreign alliance of different Western European countries to come in and put down this Boxer Rebellion. Also during this century, you've got some German influence, particularly in the Shandong region of China, and you've got the US pushing for more and more open access to Chinese ports as well. And so you've got all these Western powers sort of establishing bylines, establishing routes into China, establishing authority over China, almost to an extent carving up China like they did Africa. You've also got the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, which basically gave a lot of power to Japan in the region over China. And China felt a little bit betrayed by the Treaty of Versailles, by the people who signed the Treaty of Versailles, because it looked like it overlooked Chinese interest. It went against Woodrow Wilson's principle of self-determination because it gave Japan so much more power, so much more influence over China in specific areas. But by far the most impactful period, the most impactful event of the Century of Humiliation was the Japanese invasion of the Chinese mainland during the 30s and 40s during World War II. Now, if I asked you, the listener, hello, rhetorical person, when do you think World War II started? Your answer might depend on where you lived. If you lived in the United States, you might say it started in 1941 with the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. If you lived in Poland, you might say it started in 1939 with the Nazi invasion of Poland. If you live in China, most people would say in China that World War II started around with the invasion of Japan into their mainland. It started up north in the Manchukuo region and worked its way down. Crucially, the Japanese invasion of China was brutal. Millions and millions of people murdered, lots of resources basically taken, lots of manufacturing taken, lots of Japanese businessmen coming in and exploiting Chinese labor, people getting killed, getting bayoneted, getting their heads cut off, getting dragged through the streets, women being raped in their thousands. I mean, it is a horrific event, and this causes a lot of tension even until today between China and Japan. In fact, if you go to China today and you turn on Chinese television, one of the things you will always see on Chinese television is some sort of picture, some sort of movie depicting Chinese angst against Japan. So you've got this series of events that starts with the Opium Wars that works its way all the way down to World War II and the Japanese invasion and occupation of many parts of China that create this historical narrative of a century of humiliation, that Western powers, that regional powers are out to dominate China. And so you can see the policy today that China institutes about territorial disputes, land territorial disputes, sea territorial disputes, any foreign impact in their region. They view it with a lot of suspicion because they have this narrative that has been cultivated by and used by the Communist Party of China to say, hey, look, we don't want to be dominated by foreign forces like we were for this century of humiliation. All right, guys, well, that's the end of part one. Very important that we understand the century of humiliation. China, it's such an interesting country. I can't wait to get into the history of it, into the economics of it today, the political system of today. If you like what you've seen, share the videos, subscribe to the channel, comment below. What do you think about the century of humiliation? And remember, reality always trumps ideology.